They say the sound of a breaking heart is silent, that it happens somewhere deep inside the chest, behind the ribs, where no one else can hear it fracture. No echo, no warning, just a quiet collapse that changes everything forever. But on a clear Wednesday morning in March of 1987, Dean Martin's heart did not break quietly. It shattered with engines. The first jet arrived before anyone could prepare for it. A low, violent roar tore through the sky above the Los Angeles National Cemetery in Westwood, ripping open the calm of the morning like metal through silk. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Prayers died on lips. Even the wind seemed to freeze. Then came the second jet, then the third, then the fourth. 4 F-4 Phantom fighter jets screamed across the California sky, each engine pushing nearly 30,000 pounds of thrust. The sound was not just loud, it was physical. It struck the body before the mind could react, rattling rib cages, vibrating the ground beneath polished shoes and military boots alike. The formation was flawless. Perfect geometry carved into endless blue. For a moment, the world narrowed to nothing but noise and sky. And then it happened. One jet peeled away from the formation, climbing straight upward, alone, slicing toward the heavens as the others continued forward without it. The missing man formation. A final military salute reserved for those who would never return home. The sound swallowed everything. It drowned whispered prayers, smothered sobs, erased thought itself. And when the jets finally vanished beyond the horizon, when the thunder dissolved into nothing, the silence that followed was somehow worse. It pressed inward, it stole breath, it made every person present understand, instantly and without explanation, that something precious had been lost forever. The Los Angeles National Cemetery stretched out beneath that silence like a carefully constructed memory. Row after row of white headstones stood in perfect alignment, each one identical in size, shape, and dignity. Names etched in stone, dates that marked beginnings and endings, ranks that spoke of service, of duty, of lives that had been offered and never reclaimed. The grass was impossibly green, manicured with obsessive care. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds, creating a strange contrast, beauty laid gently over grief. It was the kind of place where death was made orderly, where loss was arranged into neat lines, as if precision could soften finality. At the center of the gathering sat a single casket, draped in the American flag. The red, white, and blue fabric lay perfectly arranged, each fold deliberate, each star visible. Beneath that flag rested Captain Dean Paul Martin, Jr., Air National Guard pilot, officer, husband, father, son, 35 years old, gone. The crowd surrounding the grave looked like the collision of two completely different worlds. On one side stood the military. Men in dress blues and service uniforms stood at attention, backs straight, faces carved into expressions of controlled neutrality. Brass buttons caught the sunlight, white gloves remained spotless, every movement was practiced, disciplined, exact. These were men trained to honor death with ritual and precision, to hold emotion behind posture and protocol. On the other side stood Hollywood. Italian silk suits, black dresses tailored by designers whose names carried weight, familiar faces from another time, another era, legends who once defined glamour, laughter, and effortless cool. Today, there was no illusion strong enough. This was not a premiere, not a celebration, not a reunion. This was a reckoning. Somewhere among the mourners stood Dean Martin. Not the Dean Martin the world knew, not the man who stumbled onto stage with a drink in his hand and still delivered perfection, not the charming drunk who made life look like one long cocktail party where nothing ever mattered too much. This Dean Martin moved carefully, as if his body had been assembled from fragile glass. His tuxedo was flawless, Italian cut, tailored precisely to his frame, but it no longer carried confidence. It hung heavier on his shoulders, weighed down by something invisible and crushing. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes. Normally they were a statement, a touch of mystery, a symbol of cool. Today they were armor. His daughter held his arm, not out of affection, but necessity. Her grip was firm, grounding him as they walked. Each step required concentration. One foot forward, then the next. Do not fall. Not here. Not now. Behind velvet ropes, cameras waited. The press had gathered early, clutching lenses and notepads like weapons, hunting for the image that would dominate front pages. The king of cool, finally breaking.
They did not understand. That moment had already passed. The cemetery felt like a gathering of ghosts. Lucille Ball sat near the front, her legendary spark extinguished. The woman who had once filled rooms with laughter now stared hollow-eyed at the ground. She had known Dean's son since he was small, before uniforms and wings, before responsibility hardened his edges. Frank Sinatra sat a few rows away, shoulders slumped, hands clenched tightly between his knees. The man who could fix anything, careers, reputations, problems with a phone call, now sat helpless. There was no call he could make, no favor he could trade. Sammy Davis Jr. sat beside him, head bowed, lifting a hand occasionally to wipe tears from his eye. The man who had danced and sung through every obstacle life threw at him looked defeated. And standing slightly apart from the main group was Jerry Lewis. His presence was unexpected. For more than 20 years, he and Dean had lived separate lives, divided by pride, silence, and wounds that never healed properly. They had orbited the same industry without touching, close enough to remember what they had lost, far enough to pretend it no longer mattered. Today, none of that mattered. A son had been lost. Everything else was meaningless. Dean Martin had built an entire career on the illusion that nothing touched him. That was the act. The carefree drunk, the man who never rehearsed and never failed, the one immune to consequences, floating through life untouched by seriousness or pain. But it had always been a performance. Behind closed doors, Dean was meticulous, focused, controlled. He understood timing, discipline, and effort better than almost anyone else. Still, his son had been something else entirely. Dean Paul Martin Jr. had worn a real uniform, not a costume. He had earned his rank through training and skill. He had flown real missions. He had accepted real risk, real danger, real responsibility. Dean had been unbearably proud of that. His son had become something Dean had only ever pretended to be. The honor guard stepped forward. The air seemed to tighten, as if the cemetery itself were holding its breath. White-gloved hands reached for the flag. The first fold, then the second. Snap. Fold. Snap. Fold. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, ancient. 13 folds in total, each one carrying symbolic meaning, each one rehearsed countless times until it lived in muscle memory. The red and white stripes vanished slowly, tucked into themselves until only the blue field remained. White stars against deep blue. A perfect triangle. A symbol. A keepsake. A brutally inadequate substitute for a child. The officer carrying the folded flag turned toward Dean. He knelt. This was the most important part of his duty, the presentation. He had practiced the words, memorized them, delivered them dozens of times. But looking into Dean Martin's hidden eyes, feeling the gravity radiating from the man, all training felt insufficient. He extended the flag. Dean reached out. His hands trembled. When the fabric touched his chest, something inside him collapsed completely. He pulled the flag toward himself, clutched it, pressed it against his body as if warmth could pass through cloth, as if love could travel backward through time. His shoulders began to shake. Behind the sunglasses, tears fell freely. The persona vanished. The act ended. Only a father remained.
He looked at the coffin one last time. Not quickly, not in a flash. He looked as if trying to memorize every detail so as never to forget. Like flowers, a lumberyard, the open space in the earth. Then he turned and didn't look back. Because if he looked, perhaps he wouldn't be able to leave. Perhaps he would sit down again on the ground beside the grave and wait there for the end. Inside the limousine, the world seemed to continue functioning normally. Cars passing by, people walking. The sun shone as on any other day. Dean held the photograph in his lap. He adjusted his sunglasses. That gesture, so simple, marked the beginning of a disappearance. In the months that followed, something in Dean Martin simply switched off. There was no announcement. There was no public statement. There was no formal farewell. He simply stopped singing, stopped showing up, stopped pretending. The invitations kept arriving, programs, recordings, tributes. He refused them all with distant politeness. Maybe later. Not now. I'm not ready. But what no one said aloud was simple. He would never be ready. Dean started frequenting the same Italian restaurant in Beverly Hills, a discreet place far from the spotlight. He always sat at the same table, in the back, away from the hustle and bustle. He dressed simply, without glamour, without effort. He always ordered the same dish. He ate without haste, but without pleasure. The staff knew not to bother him. They didn't ask for photos. They didn't ask for autographs. They just left the food and walked away. He was a ghost haunting his own life. People recognized him, of course, but they whispered instead of getting closer. There was a silent respect at a distance, a tacit understanding that certain pains shouldn't be interrupted. The king of cool had become the king of silence. Frank would call. He would invite. He would show up. Dean would answer politely, but always distantly. Another day, Frank. Maybe next week. I'm tired today. Jerry Lewis wrote letters. He tried to reconnect. Dean would respond politely, but without warmth. That hug in the cemetery had been real,
but there wasn't enough strength to rebuild what no longer existed. Sometimes Dean would say he would return to the stage. He would smile in that old way. He would say he missed the music, that the audience was waiting for him. But those who listened knew. It was just an attempt to convince himself that there was still something to return to. There wasn't one. The years passed slowly. 1987 became 1988. 1988 became 1990. The Rat Pack began to disappear, one by one. When Sammy Davis Jr. died, Dean didn't come to the funeral. Another coffin, another flag, another goodbye. He couldn't survive that.
If you've made it to the end of this story, it's because you felt the weight of this silence. Stories like this don't live on stages, nor in applause, nor in the myths that Hollywood has built. They live behind the scenes, in difficult choices, in losses that no one can stage. If you want to continue discovering who Dean Martin really was, beyond the smile, beyond the fame, beyond the character, subscribe now to Dean Martin, Secrets Behind the Applause channel. Like this video, it helps the channel continue bringing real, profound, and forgotten stories. And in the comments, tell me, what was the moment in this story that most impacted you? Here, the myth falls silent, and the truth remains.